So we hit the hour. Let's get started. Paolo and Anna, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself in a minute. I'm just going to very quickly set the scene here. So, you know, a lot of the time, I think when we're imagining this enormous challenge of getting ourselves to net zero, at least me, I often feel like we spend all our time thinking about solutions that are super important, but quite small. You know, we look at like little technology improvements in this sector and this sector, and these are all essential. I don't mean to diminish the importance of any of them, but you know, they are quite sector specific and maybe only affect a small area of the market. And this session, I think, is about something a lot bigger than that. And its genesis is a conversation I had with Paolo. A colleague of mine said, oh, you need to touch base with Paolo. He's doing some really interesting work and on supply chains. And so I was excited to call him up, and I expected it to be a conversation about supply chain technology and tracking and the kind of quite nerdy in the weeds stuff. And about 5 minutes into our conversation, I realized, wow, like this is all those things, but it's also a really, really big idea and a big potentially transformative idea. And then Paolo mentioned, and other people soon after mentioned to me, oh, Anna is working on a related project. So I touched base with her too. And I'm so delighted that I was able to get you both together to discuss this exciting work that you're doing on tracking the progress of carbon through supply chains. And I want to give you the chance to explain what you're working on and talk about just how impactful it could be. So I will stop talking. We're going to hear from Anna first, and then we're going to hear from Paolo, and we will have a chance to, after your remarks and some panel discussion, we'll have a chance to take questions from the audience. So do put them in the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you for having me today. And I'm really excited to be getting into a room with Paolo. We talk on many different occasions about this topic, and it's actually nice to be able to share some of the conversations we're having kind of one-on-one or with our teams in a broader setting. So yeah, welcome everyone to this session. I'm Anna. I am a manager for climate action at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a global CEO-led organization working towards helping companies really move towards a more sustainable world in a kind of coalition and collaboration context. And within the World Business Council, I lead the work on emissions transparency, focusing in particular on supply chains and scope 3. And what really drives me in my work, and I think, you know, I just wanted to share this kind of, I guess, nugget of information about myself up front, because I feel like it's useful to understand where we also as individuals come into these situations and topics that we work on. I'm really passionate about helping companies and individuals and empowering them to kind of find tangible solutions to sustainability challenges of all sorts, but you know, also really helping them to try and make an impact, and as much of an impact as they possibly can. So that's really what drives me in my day-to-day work, and also is closely aligned with actually what I'm working on, because you know, the focus of my work really is on equipping companies with the tools needed to accelerate their decarbonization journey. So I wanted to take us on a little journey of our own this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are, and start with a little visioning exercise, and you know, really to kind of give you a feel for what this topic is that we're working on at the WBCSD. So maybe imagine it's 2030 and you're going to the supermarket to stock up on, say, washing powder, and on the packaging, just very much like, you know, you're used to it when you look at meals in supermarkets and kind of different food products, you actually find a carbon label. And the carbon label tells you the exact footprint of that exact product, relying, you know, kind of in the making, obviously as a consumer, you don't see it, but relying in the making of that carbon label on different information parts, kind of from the whole value chain of the product and all the emissions which have been created in the process of it. Maybe, you know, another example, you're in a business, you work in a accountancy reporting role within a big company, and you've been asked by your boss to help shed some light on all your, you know, or you've wanted you driving the shedding of some light on the carbon baseline across all the company's products. And scope 3 emissions, which, you know, are a huge share of companies' carbon footprint, a lot of the emissions must be included in this baselining exercise. Previously, you might have asked all of your different suppliers to fill out Excel sheets, you know, maybe one tier down if you're lucky. These suppliers have received many different requests for information. But at this point in time, and you maybe previously also filled in some data gaps using secondary data, using industry averages, proxies, or just assumptions to maybe make up your baseline of the company's, of the product's carbon footprint. But now today, you don't have to do any of it because you can just simply calculate the product footprint of every single individual product based on real data that's been passed along all companies in your value chain from one step to the next. And once you've calculated that footprint on your kind of where you are in the value chain, you can actually pass that along. And you're safe in the knowledge that that data has been calculated consistently according to one joint methodology. These two examples will kind of, I guess, there are many more scenarios we can envisage and many more kind of things which maybe happen. Maybe it's 2030, maybe it's, sooner, maybe it's later on. But I think one thing that's really clear is that we cannot do that today on this in-depth level, on a product level for individual products throughout the whole value chain. And if you can, I'd be really surprised and pretty impressed, and please do reach out. But in any case, I think, this exact carbon footprinting it's really, it's just, we're just not able to do it. And it's really also very difficult to actually pass on data in value chains, I think, as we'll, definitely hear from my side, but also from Paolo's side later on. So how can you really decarbonize, and how can you actually be efficient and effective in tackling some of these big carbon issues sitting within your company? Or how can you make informed consumer decisions if you don't actually know the carbon footprint attached to what you're buying? Emissions transparency, I guess, really, and I really like the title of the session because I think it's so true. Emissions transparency is really a game changer. And I think some of the tech and some of the things that we bring to the table to make it happen are also game changing. So, one of the things that I really wanted to take away from what we're talking about today, really for me, it's the most important thing, that emissions transparency is a game changer, but it can't really happen if you don't have collaboration. And collaboration it's so essential in all of this. And I'm sure we'll touch upon it a little bit more in detail later on, and I'll give you kind of a flavor of why it's so important to me as well. Within the work that we're doing in the WBCSD, we are working in a setting, a project which is called the Carbon Transparency Partnership. And in this project, we're really trying to tackle and kind of get from this point of where we can't do any of these things around product carbon data to the point where we can actually do these things around product carbon data, that the scenarios that I described are the ones that we can actually realize. We want to help companies have visibility on real carbon footprints on a product level, to actually share and be able to share that data and then actually act upon it in a more targeted manner to reduce carbon emissions, by the amount that clearly at the moment we're not on the right track to do so. So the two things that we're doing really to make that happen, on the one hand, we're working on a methodology for the calculation and allocation of carbon emissions on a product level, and also on the infrastructure to exchange and share that carbon emissions across different industries and value chains. On the methodological side of things, we are really trying to build on what's already out there, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard, other standards, product category rules, other things in the space which are really important, but also to try and increase the consistency, the granularity, and also the integration of that emissions data. And then on the tech side of things, we're trying to create a network of networks, really putting tech at the center of this and enabling different solution providers, different networks, different solutions with the focus around carbon to really exchange information in an interoperable and confidential and reliable manner. So I guess the key things to take away from our project is that, we're really unique in that we focus on primary level data. We're extremely collaborative across many different players along the value chain. And I think the most important part, and this is where Paolo really comes in as well, we want to create open systems, and we want to use tech to be able to really link up different initiatives and different players focusing on tackling carbon emissions to make sure that we all work in the same direction and are actually able to exchange all the relevant data on a product level, but also relating to other things with each other without any issues. So I guess, to me, the prerequisites to achieving that, they're all there. We have the technological capabilities, we have different players tackling different issues in different industries, or also, more overarchingly, we have the consumer desire to have more sustainable products, and we actually also have the political will. On the EU level, which is where I'm based, there's a lot of stuff coming in, a lot of legislation planned in the future around enabling and almost forcing companies, I guess, to some degree, to be more transparent on their environmental carbon footprints around their products, for example, but also sharing more information in the form of digital product passports. So there really is this triumvirate of different entities coming together. And the one thing that we really need, and this is what I said at the beginning, the one key thing in all of this is collaboration. We need to connect the dots. We need to create alignment. We need to share expertise and work together, between the different data systems and different tech solutions which are being created. Consumers must be integrated into this process. And people like me and Paolo working on these different topics, we must ensure that we're closely aligned and closely exchange. So if you take away one thing today, is that carbon emissions transparency is super important and collaboration is the way to get there.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. So I have lots of questions about that, but let's hear from Paolo first, and then we'll dive into questions. And just to remind the audience, you can put your own questions to Anna and Paolo. Just put them in the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So I have Paolo's slides here, which I'm going to attempt to share. Just give me 1 second.
We were successful just a few minutes ago, so yes, here we go.
There we go. So Paolo, just tell me when you want to move through them.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. Hi, Anna. It's great to be here with you to discuss. Just a quick intro to myself. I'm leading the supply chain emissions initiative at RMI. Been with RMI for about 6 years now. I'm based in New York City. And before dealing with supply chain emissions, I've been involved in other areas of the industrial transition. In particular, I used to run a program where we were engaging mining companies to decarbonize. Today, I'm going to talk about the nerdy stuff that Jim was mentioning before at the introduction. And in particular, a vision that we have for a future world in which GHG disclosures are going to become digitally native, and that will extend to ESG as well. I'll talk to that in a minute. So the vision here is that your emissions one day will be disclosed based on a digital wallet of your Scope 1, Scope 2, and most importantly, Scope 3 emissions. And this has been really the basis of our latest project that we have called Horizon Zero, and that was recently funded by the Larsen Lamb Climate Change Foundation. The premise is really simple. We want to figure out digitally native GHG disclosures, starting in the cryptocurrency industry. I'll get back to why that is the case, and then we will take that system and apply it to material supply chains and in industrial sectors. So let me take a step back here and explain why we got there and how. So on the next slide, as you all know, in the last decade, you have seen companies adopting science-based targets. Half of the S&P 500 companies have sustainability goals, and science-based targets are becoming the gold standards. Financial institutions are particularly keen on that. Governments are starting to mandate reporting. All of this is based on Scope 1 and 2 targets, that is, targets on emissions that companies can control. You are a manufacturer, you have a certain energy load, you can buy renewable energy and green up your Scope 2 target, and so on. Where things get tricky, really, is with Scope 3, supply chain emissions. And the question becomes, how far up and down the supply chain can you see? The emissions that you are accountable for essentially come through the products that are purchased and sold, so through the product level, as Anna was saying. What do you see at the product level? You see the volumes that are purchased and sold. And currently, most of the estimates for Scope 3 emissions are done by multiplying those volumes by emissions factors. And those factors are often averages, global averages. And the problem here is that this does not incentivize anybody in the supply chain to get better, because you're using a generic factor. So all of this is to say, Scope 3 emissions are the next big thing. just as all these companies are setting targets on scope 1 and 2, soon they will move to scope 3, and you will very soon be after scope 3 reductions, and you will not know how to measure those. The existing accounting frameworks need to be brought up to speed, and we think that a kind of pipeline data to action of things need to happen. In the next slide, you have the things that we believe are needed. First of all, to create to the goal of climate differentiation, you will need to move from calculations to see the actuals, so improve the visibility. Secondly, methodologies need to be harmonized. This is true for accounting methodologies. We have a project called Project Comet that we are working in a partnership with the UNFCCC for improving harmonization of carbon accounting methodologies. The relevant part here is that there are allocation principles for scope 3 that also need to be improved. I'll expand on that in a minute. We believe that digital infrastructure is needed. Digital disclosures are the way to go. And finally, we need product standards that will lead to differentiated markets. I want to dwell a little more for a minute on what I mean by data, digital infrastructure and the data architecture. So in the next slide, I said that the scope 3 travels at the product level. What we have in mind is using distributed ledger technology to provide a solution to that. And that's why we are piloting it with cryptocurrency. I promised I would get back to that. Crypto is a place where an industry where the problem of carbon intensity is keenly real, perceived, and that's also a DLT native environment. So it's an ideal sandbox to start. So this is what the problem looks like to us. Each step of the production of any good has GHG emissions. The emissions get allocated from the assets onto the products, and then all these emissions essentially travel down the supply chain through the product level. And the final product has collected all the emissions from all the steps. So what we have in mind is a digital system of tracking with a distributed ledger that tracks transactions to solve the problem and bring the visibility that any of these players would need deep in their supply chain. In the next slide, this is why I think that an initiative like WBCSD Pathfinder is so well thought. The product level, like I said, is really where the emissions travel. And if we can promote the visibility of actual emissions, then the signals will be sent up and down supply chains to the players that really need to decarbonize, even if they are removed. And also think of mechanisms that are being introduced, like the upcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. That's going to put enormous pressure on disclosures for importers, and that will create advantage for those that are compliant with the standard. Digital compliance would be massively more robust than any other system. You have the current mechanism here for defining a differentiated commodity. It involves many steps. There's a central certification and all that. We envision a future mechanism where you have a digitally native protocol that tracks embodied emissions, and that will be your disclosure. Finally, Horizon Zero aims at generating the architecture that enables those disclosures to be digital. This is at the core of the activity that I'm leading in our program that is called Climate Intelligence. In the next slide, you will recognize the pipeline from emissions visibility all the way down to markets and the sectors of focus that are essentially, besides cryptocurrency, the other sectors are where the largest buckets of emissions lie. It's steel, cement, oil and gas, aviation, and other metals like aluminum. The vision here is that in 5 years' time, we see companies making a scope 3 target and then also declaring a digital target for a portion of that scope 3 that is going to be verified via digital disclosures. In 10 years' time, this this is going to be part of financial disclosures like US GAAP and IFRS. And from GHG, broader ESG will follow. Land use, water intensity, labor standards. There was a comment just in the chat that says, you know, that's the next horizon, and that's exactly what we're going to towards. The important thing here will be to have a single data architecture, kind of like the MP3 format for GHG and ESG, so that everyone, open source, will use the same format for talking about emissions and making scope 3 targets really actionable. That's all I have to say here. Thanks everyone for listening, and I look forward to questions. And if you're interested, at this stage, we are actively speaking with players in the sectors that I mentioned. So if you're interested, please get in touch.
Great, thanks Paolo and Anna. So I have a couple of questions of my own. Totally want to encourage everyone else to put their questions in. Just add them to the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will relay them to Paolo and Anna. So Paolo, maybe I could start with you, because you talked about doing cryptocurrency and then moving on to other sectors. And I think doing this anywhere sounds really challenging, but also I can kind of imagine what it looks like in cryptocurrency, because I assume when we talk about emissions, we're basically talking about compute power and the electricity used to power the computers that do the mining. If we compare that to something like, you know, the breakfast cereal that I ate this morning that is made from wheat, that comes from different parts of the US, that was aggregated en route to the food processor, which then, you know, they may not even know which farmers it came from. It sounds like, well, suddenly we are into a challenge, a tracking challenge, which is a different order of magnitude. So I'd love to hear a bit more from both of you about how we're going to untangle that tracking with these big complex sectors.
Yes. So Jim, what I can say to that point you just made is that, yes, it's a different order of magnitude of challenge for sure, but conceptually it's the same thing. That's why we think that crypto is a good starting point, because you have an industry, a supply chain, if crypto can be defined as a supply chain, that has an emission point upstream, and that emission needs to travel through everyone that holds the currency as the currency gets exchanged to represent that emission that will be the scope 3 of whoever is holding the Bitcoin or otherwise. So conceptually, it is the same problem.
And I guess, I mean, from my side, you know, I hate to harp on about it, but I think collaboration really is the key in this. I think often when we talk about emission transparency, you know, we kind of, you know, say, well, it's quite easy to do, you know, I mean, nobody's done it before, but, you know, we'll just do it and we'll just get there. I mean, simple, right? And actually, I think you really hit the nail on the head. It is extremely complex. And the only way in my opinion, you can really unpack that is if you kind of, you know, go step by step, you try and find the little parcels, you really unpack the problem into all the different areas, but you also make sure that everyone's part of the conversation, so that it's not something which kind of happens top down from the, you know, the final person in the value chain, that they push on their suppliers and all the way down the value chain. And, you know, some of the suppliers are also big companies, but that they really don't push their vision and their approach onto it, but that we actually include everyone from the value chain as many different industries as possible. And also talk to the small companies, the SMEs, understand their problems. You know, I mean, we're talking about kind of passing on information along value chains. Some people don't even know how to calculate these emissions on an organizational level, let alone a product level. So I think that collaboration piece and that kind of making sure everyone is part of the story and part of the puzzle is really, really key. And it is a gradual process. It's not going to happen overnight. I think that's also one of the big things that we have to realize in the space. But that's exactly what we're trying to do at WBCSD, is to try and pull together those different stakeholders, bringing together different initiatives, bringing together also people who focus, for example, you know, as Paolo was saying, on I don't know, oil and gas and hard to abate sectors, but getting them into conversations with people who are tackling other sectors to also help each other understand what the respective problems are and actually leverage those synergies. And I think the other part of it is also to realize that it's not just about, and I know this is what today is about, you know, technology and kind of protocols and methodology. It's also about understanding what needs to happen at the individual level in terms of incentivization of the supply chain, capability building, all those things around that to actually make this happen.
Yeah, so that makes total sense to me, but I'm gonna play the role of the cynical moderator here, and I'm gonna say, if we go back to breakfast cereal again, I could totally see some big players, because I know there are some big food companies that are really aggressive on climate, and I can see them saying, yeah, we're in, we want to work with our suppliers to make this happen. But then I also think about farmers who are dealing with so many challenges right now, big consolidation in the industry, very tight margins, crazy weather, and seeing like their neighbors go out of business, and then someone comes along and says, okay, we need you to have a digital wallet where you track the carbon associated with your crop, and it's like, well, this is just a big headache. So I'm being very cynical here to kind of provoke you into helping me understand how we solve problems like that. I guess I'm saying, how do we help people who are not motivated to join the system because they're kind of busy elsewhere? How do we get them involved? Well,
the simple answer is they need to be made aware that this is creating value. We're all about creating the differentiation of something that can prove positive GHG attributes. It's kind of like when you discuss, that brings me back to, I was testifying to Congress yesterday about the reform of an old mining law in the US. And the debate was around how should we adopt better environmental standards for mining in this country? And on the backdrop of the fact that in other parts of the world there are lower environmental standards, and therefore production happens at a lower cost. And the answer is not to reduce the environmental standards in this country, it's actually to uphold them and make sure that those producers that produce with attributes that make their product better can prove it into the market. And of course, it's a bit complicated and it's a bit nerdy to think about a digital wallet, but that's the way to go. So it's about creating more value for the production that you have. So yes, of course, it will not be easy, and it will start piecemeal. We have selected some sectors that we believe are more prime for trying this. It will be kind of compartmentalized in the beginning, but we definitely believe that this is the way to go. In terms of economics, this is about pricing and externality. So it's putting a price on something good you're doing, or on not doing something bad.
And I mean, one of the things we're already seeing is that banks, for example, are actually starting to really think about who they loan money to on the basis of these environmental factors. So there's also an additional incentive for you, equally, there's also likely to be on maybe a subsidy level at some point, in time, that from government subsidies, that this might be attached to kind of better ESG performance on an individual level. In the EU, notably, that again, where I am, but there are laws that are coming in that actually are going to regulate that you have to disclose the environmental footprints of your products. So what are you going to do, right? I think there's to some degree you're also forced to act on it, but there is that incentive that's probably also likely to come through from different sides. And I think the other thing also, where there are really small players, and where kind of you are a big company wanting this information from a small player, I also think to some degree we need to assume the responsibilities that we have in these value chains, and actually understand that if we want something, we also have to help get there. I think that's a really big, important piece of the puzzle. And then finally, there are some things already ongoing. In, for example, Paolo, you mentioned the mining sector. I know there's some really cool startups providing really simple tech to people, and I know not every farmer has a smartphone, of course, but providing very simple means to help farmers understand their footprints, understand in the mining space the social implications of what they're doing, having teams on the ground going out there, educating them. I think there is also, again, this big role of technology, maybe not the kind that we're working on, but also more small scale, local targeted technology that can actually make this whole process a lot more easy. And to be honest, if you're the first person in the supply chain, it's probably going to be easier to pull that information together than if you're in the middle somewhere and you have all these different parties that actually have to do their bit in order for you to do it.
Great, thank you both. So I want to make sure we get through some of the questions we're getting from the audience, which seem great. Paolo and Anna, I'll leave it to you. Maybe if you just choose one of you to tackle each question, because I want to prioritize getting through as many as possible, and I'll leave it to you to decide who's best to answer them. Here's one from Adam Standard, who's saying, are we really just talking about refining the process that goes into calculating emissions factors for calculating off of financials to get scope-free values? So I think Adam is saying, like, is this just an extension of the process we already use to calculate emissions factors, or is it more nuanced than that?
Can I take that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's probably for both of us, it's probably not an easy one to answer. But I think, I mean, what we're trying to do at the moment in our project, it's taking what we're already doing, but being much more specific on it. So, if Paolo was to take the Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard and calculate the emissions for your breakfast cereal, and I was to do the same exercise, we would likely come to completely different results, because there's so many bits of assumptions, and maybe there's a product category rule which regulates how breakfast cereal is to be calculated. But even then, there is room for interpretation. So it is kind of getting more into the depth and being more specific on what's already out there. But it's not using, the financials, and it's not kind of the way we're going about the emissions factors. It's, for us, in any case, in our approach, it's really the emission factors which get passed down by your supplier that you then use and integrate into your calculations. So it's much more specific than that.
Paolo, do you want to have a go too? I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, so the vision here is to really move to actuals and over time do away with emissions factors, so that you would have a parcel of emission, an attribute that would travel down the supply chain, and you in the cereals example, you would know exactly what is the emission from the cereals as it travels down the supply chain. The problem there is not just one of technology using DLT to create the chain of custody, but also one of allocation protocols. Right now, the GHG protocol doesn't really go into the detail of how you split emissions from a facility into from an asset into the product as it travels down the supply chain, how you split as the product changes into the various intermediary products. So all of these things need to be addressed to get to the final answer as to what are the actual emissions that are embodied in a product.
Great, thank you. So let's take another one. This is from Candace Burgesh. Candace, sorry if I'm mangling your second name there. And she's asking, how have you discussed protecting proprietary and competitive information while encouraging transparency on product manufacturing and operations?
I think, again, we can probably both talk to that, but I think that really is at the heart of where technology comes in and plays a role. And I know there's another question about blockchain later on, and I'll say very openly from the WBCSD side of things, we're quite agnostic to blockchain or no blockchain, as long as there's a way to kind of keep things secret and also maintain data sovereignty. So I think that sense that companies control who they share the data with, and what they share, I think, is a really important part of the puzzle, and also that they can make sure that the data only goes as far out of their system as they feel comfortable. So to our members that we work with, it's a huge concern, and it's also one of the fundamental principles for the system to work, is to be able to be sure that these kinds of things work without revealing too much, which is competitive. So one of the things, for example, which we're not for sure doing, is revealing bills of materials or allowing for back tracing and all that. So I think that's really a key fundamental principle of what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, I subscribe to all of that.
Thank you. So from Phil Foti, the question is, do you envisage using blockchain and other mechanisms, and what systems stroke maintenance burden will be placed on suppliers and buyers to handle tracking the entire product up and down the supply chain?
Well, I would be out of my depth here if I had to comment exactly on the technicalities, because that's not my trade. And also, we have just started working on this. That's why we will need a period of testing and collaboration. We're setting up pilots to try and hash out exactly all the complications of using blockchain or not blockchain or another system to make sure that we deliver on what's needed.
Okay, we'll take one more. Navin Kunde is asking, he's curious as to why you pick steel and cement versus an easier to pilot value chain like food and beverage, where previous movements like fair trade, coffee have established transparency to the farmer level.
There are two ways to answer this question. One is that the opportunistic version is that at RMI, we have been focusing on industry and industrial emissions, and so that's our trade. The other way to answer is that steel and cement together account for over half of industrial emissions, so we decided to move on the big ticket items. We understand that it's complex. Steel, I want to say, is a little more aligned with this vision, and in fact, we are planning to run a pilot on tracking steel emissions from a steel maker all the way down to a manufacturer. On the cement and concrete supply chain, there are more complexities. Most of the cement and concrete, of course, ends in infrastructure, but it's definitely something that's top of our mind as a problem to solve.
And I think this is where the collaboration aspect comes back into it, because Paolo and his team, they're working on these different hard to abate sectors. As part of the partnership, for example, we are also moving towards creating a deep dive with a focus on the automotive industry and trying to find ways, for Paolo and the work that they're doing to collaborate with some of the work that the automotive initiatives are doing. So that really is kind of like creating those links between the different industries and also bringing together the different parties to make sure that the automotive industry is linked into the chemicals industry, where some of our players also work. So I think that's a really important part of it.
Great, thank you both. So we have less than 10 minutes. I want to make sure before the end we just get to a quick discussion about what happens next. So I would love to hear from both of you regards your respective projects. Like, what does the next year or two look like? What are you going to be doing? And critically, what do you need? What can people in the audience, which is, I imagine, a mixture of corporates and policy people and investors and entrepreneurs, how can these communities work with you to accelerate your projects?
I will say half of my answer and then let Anna continue. So in the immediate, Horizon Zero, like I said at the beginning, starts with figuring out the solution for cryptocurrency, and we want to have that, at least the basics of that, ready by Climate Week later this year. We, at the same time, will start working on a pilot in steel and potentially aviation services to prove the concept in those two sectors by having, again, something to say by the end of this year, maybe the full pilot in the beginning of the next. And then at the same time, we will expand on the other sectors. We are keen to collaborate with WBCSD Pathfinder 2 that covers other sectors as part of the Carbon Transparency Partnership, because it is key for us that the data architecture is common and we create something that is compatible and that everyone will use to define digital GHG attributes.
And I think that links very nicely into what we're going to be doing. So, on the one hand, one of the big ticket items that we're really focusing on is to ensure interoperability between different networks and tech solutions. So that's a big priority for us going forward. We're already working together with some of the big tech companies in this space, but also some startup companies, and then tying in with different initiatives in different industries, like, and kind of what RMI are doing, they're definitely kind of spanning a lot of different industries and really important industries. So we're really closely aligning on the tech side of things. On the methodological side of things, and I think this is probably also, one of the most exciting things for me as well, we're going to be publishing our draft methodological framework, or the guidance document towards COP26. Really then, hoping to really move to the next phase of actually being able to start implementing this in organizations, trying to understand what some of the hurdles are. And also, as we kind of move along and work with different industries, and kind of this framework is more overarching across industry based. So we're trying to then get the different parts where different industries focus on their own specific issues to also integrate that into the broader framework. So those are really the big next two things for us, and to really create this network structure behind it that then enables companies to actually apply the framework and exchange information across tech systems. Equally, as Paolo said, I mean, we're really interested in connecting with stakeholders, and we're trying to expand the industry spread that we have to really make sure that we're linked into all the different industries, because if the worst thing that could happen for us is if an entire industry goes off by its own, tries to solve all these problems, solves all the problems for the industry, and then actually doesn't fit in with what other industries have come together to see as the way forward. Because then essentially this kind of disjointed system we currently have is just going to be recreated. So for us, it's really important to create that alignment across industries. So if you're a stakeholder, reach out, to me to see how you can kind of get involved. I'll post the link to our project into the chat, so you've got my email address. If you're a standard setting body, anyone kind of who works with the LCA and kind of focused on that space, do reach out, because we're also really working closely with companies and like CDP, we're exchanging with them quite closely. We're trying to align with the European Commission, all sorts of different players, to make sure that there really is that alignment. So we really are always interested in expanding the reach that we have. And I think most importantly of all, I think you can really start by, trying also within your organizations to kind of raise, if it's not already there, raise this awareness of the need to actually move towards a more digitally native approach to this topic.
Thank you. And then Paolo, I think you only did half the question, so take the other half now.
Yes, of course. And by the way, I just posted a link to with a summary of our vision in the chat. We're also working on two other things. One is connecting all this to how companies should conceive their pathways of decarbonization. This effort is primarily descriptive, i.e. we are working on how to effectively describe emissions. We don't have a say on the prescriptive part. What should your target be? How should you progress? We are part of Mission Possible Partnership. That is a broad coalition that RMI is part of, and WBCSD also. We look to that forum to make sure that we plug our effort that is descriptive into how targets are set. So that's one thing. The other thing, I mentioned Project Comet in my presentation. We are partnering with the UNFCCC to understand how business disclosures, that is what we focus on, can interact with national level GHG disclosures that are made as part of GHG inventory by, as you know, member countries to track their alignment with the Paris Agreement. So that's another part of the project, because it's the same emissions at the end of the day, they just get calculated differently.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. So we have just 3 minutes left. One final question. So Anna, I think you at the beginning asked people to jump forward to 2030 and imagine this world in which we have carbon labels on our food, which I find extremely exciting. So that's nice, we've got carbon labels on our food, but what difference does that make? I'd love you to speculate on the impact that these processes could have. Let's imagine it goes as well as you could possibly hope, and it's rolled out across many sectors, and we actually have this tracking and this labeling. How does that impact the kind of the changes we need to see?
I mean, I think the carbon label probably stands for, as a metaphor for a lot of different things businesses can actually do within their own organizations. So I think this need to step up, accelerate the speed at which we actually decarbonize is actually the outcome we'll receive out of it. And if we really exchange this emission data across the value chains, across different companies, they are actually able to realize so many different use cases. And, some of them we don't really like talking about because they're not, they're difficult, right? But trying to also help their understand where their suppliers are, trying to help their suppliers decarbonize, take more targeted R&D action and understand what products they need to invest more money into to become, more low carbon on those specific products. So I think there are certain aspects even within the companies that you can do, but equally we as a consumer will have much more stronger power to actually influence where the money goes. Equally, investors are already now starting to pressurize companies, saying that they're not going to be investing if there's no visible change in how companies behave. So I also think there's, like I said, we don't really like talking about it, but there's also a huge financial impact that companies can have as a result of this. And I think the biggest thing also, kind of that was mentioned in the chat, carbon is just the beginning. Paolo mentioned it briefly. We're also thinking about it. What are the other ESG factors that you can put into such a system? How can we think about measuring biodiversity and actually passing on that information in a very similar manner, having a biodiversity label or maybe a kind of integrated environmental label on a product? How can we think about water? There are so many use cases. If we can actually connect these value chains and connect the data sharing, I think that's going to be a really, really powerful thing and have a huge impact.
That's great. Thank you, Paolo. We're kind of out of time, but do you want to just quickly, is there an addition there you want to make to Anna's vision?
No, I think she put it really nicely.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope everyone in the audience sort of got a sense of the kind of big picture project that's going on here and how transformative it could be. I'm so glad we had a chance to hear more about this. We'll certainly be coming back to this in future years at Verge Net Zero and at greenbiz.com, where we write about net zero issues. If you want to learn more and possibly get involved, both Paolo and Anna have posted links in the chat. So do click on them before you leave and follow up. And thank you so much for everyone's questions. I'm sorry I didn't manage to get to all of them. But like I said, we will be coming back to this topic in the future and hope to be able to answer your questions next time. Okay, we'll wrap up there. Thanks so much, Paolo and Anna.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.